let's dive right into it. You're a scientist, you're an expert on vaccine and vaccine injuries, and you wrote a book with RFK Jr. Tell us a little bit about yourself and also tell us a little bit about the book that you wrote with RFK Jr.
Sure. Well, I am what's called a biochemical engineer. That was where the degree that I received when I got my PhD back in 1990. And I've been in the biotechnology industry doing research for, the past 33 or so years. And I became interested in vaccine injury in the late 1990s, early 2000s, because my son himself sustained a quite severe vaccine injury from his 15-month vaccines. And so I've been studying the epidemiology of vaccine injury and actually contributing to the field since that time. And one of the things that we've been asking the government to do, RFK and I, is to do a study of vaccinated versus unvaccinated children, do a study of vaccinated versus unvaccinated adults, and let's look at the long-term health outcomes. And so we've been, really calling out for this for a long time. But Mr. Kennedy contacted me in 2019 and said, let's go out into the open literature and see who's done this type of research independently. And so when he contacted me initially, I thought, oh, we'll find a few studies on PubMed and, maybe a few things that we can highlight. And, 60 studies later, we really came to the conclusion that this was a book. And it was right as the COVID-19 vaccine had been released. So we continued to do research, and we found, in total over 100 studies that are featured in the book, including about 20 studies regarding the recent COVID-19 shots. And this was published in August of this year. And we actually are continuing to find studies after that, and we're already planning a second edition of the book.
Wow, wow. So, in terms of vaccine injuries, I mean, for people that don't understand, could you tell us a little bit about the extent of how many people have been injured, what that ratio is in terms of, the people that got it versus that were injured? Could you tell us a little bit about that data?
Sure. Well, if you look at, sort of the standard party line of the Centers for Disease Control and the Department of Health and Human Services, they will say that vaccine injury is really 1 in a million. But there was a study that was done. It was sponsored by the CDC. It was done between 2006 and 2009. And what they really found was that the rate of vaccine injury was per needle stick, per vaccine, it was about 2.6%, or one or 2 to 3 for every 100 vaccines given. And then when you factored in the fact that people were getting multiple vaccines, then the rate of vaccine injury, and this would be a serious adverse event rated as serious, is about 1 in 10. And so, a lot of people have autoimmune disorders, neurological disorders. Of course, we're in a society right now that's swimming in chronic disorders. And so, the rates of vaccine injury are actually much, much higher than what the federal officials would report.
In terms of the deep platforming, because it seems as though the minute that RFK Jr. yourself started talking about vaccine injuries and essentially started bringing up questions about, are these vaccines safe? What are the long-term ramifications? Seems as though there was a lot of deplatforming happening. I mean, immediately it seems as though you were deplatformed and RFK Jr. Was deplatformed.
That's correct. We featured, when we started finding studies, we featured these on Mr. Kennedy's Instagram and Facebook accounts. And so we would distill down each study to really, very plain, easily understandable graphics and summaries of each study. And he would post these on Instagram and Facebook. And 60 studies into it and 60 Instagram, Facebook posts later, then he was completely deplatformed. He was a part of what was called the Disinformation Dozen regarding vaccines and vaccine adverse events. And as a part of that, then they were all deplatformed at the same time, including Mr. Kennedy. And so we decided, if they're gonna take that approach, then we might as well put this into a book.
take me through the book. So the book is called Unvax.
Vax Unvax, Let the
Hmm.
Science Speak.
Okay.
And as you go through the book, the first chapter is more of a quest to find these studies and just an overview, sort of an introduction to, what we found. And then we jump right into the second chapter where we look at health outcomes of children following the full vaccination schedule, the full CDC vaccination schedule, versus those children who are completely unvaccinated. And we found some really astounding things even in that first chapter, that the rate of developmental delays was twice as high in the vaccinated group. The rate of asthma was 4.5 times higher in the vaccinated group. And in some of these studies, the study authors compared fully vaccinated to fully unvaccinated. In some of them, they were partially vaccinated and fully vaccinated compared to unvaccinated. But overall, the rate of chronic disease was much, much higher, and in some instances, even infectious disease, things like respiratory infections and pneumonia and ear infections were about 4 times higher in the vaccinated group compared to the unvaccinated group. So there was something going on that, by this many vaccines given to a small developing immune system, was actually suppressing innate immunity and then causing some of these chronic disorders.
I mean, it seems as though, from what you're saying, that it's dangerous to vax children. I mean, it seems as though you're harming children by vaccinating them, versus, what you're told is that you're vaccinating the children in order to avoid harm.
Exactly. And vaccines can and do prevent the infectious diseases that they're designed for. I mean, we had no problem showing that the rate of chickenpox was higher in the unvaccinated than the vaccinated. And the rates of things like measles or rubella were also higher in the vaccinated than the unvaccinated. But the chronic health issues really, really stood out, throughout the entire book, not only looking at children, but also looking at adults. And, we're right now in the United States, we're in a chronic health epidemic. For every dollar spent for healthcare in the United States, 84 cents of that dollar goes to treat chronic disorders. And so, yeah, infectious diseases, they're waning. They have waned precipitously since the introduction of sanitation in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so, we see that, but really looking at health today, we have so many chronic disorders, both in childhood and adult populations, that I think we really need to take a step back and say, what are we doing?
Wow, wow. So, I mean, how did we get to this point where it seems as though we are vaccinating children to the point of actually damaging their health, completely opposite of what it were sold, which is that we're doing this to actually help their health?
Well, what happened, primarily with the vaccination schedule, is that it really expanded starting in the 1990s, in the early 1990s. And that was right after the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And that is the act, the congressional act that raised a liability shield that protected pharmaceutical manufacturers from liability in vaccine injury. And so that has been, it's been ruled in the Supreme Court and affirmed and even strengthened in 2011. But if you look at the expansion of the vaccination schedule, when I was a kid, I think I got like 5 different vaccines. But now if you look at the schedule that's given, recommended by the CDC, it's over 73 vaccines between the ages of 0 and 18, with 26 of those vaccines given in the first year of life. And so, we've drastically increased the number of vaccines, increased the different diseases that we're trying to protect against. But I think it really, in essence, is backfiring.
I mean, how is it that, it's kind of obvious from what you're telling me, right? Like, I'm putting the pieces together, figuring out the math, and it seems as though more vaccines equals worse health, hence we've gone down a really bad direction. I mean, is that accurate to say it that way?
I think that's a really accurate assessment. And when you look at what's driving the CDC, what's driving the FDA, what's driving the National Institutes of Health, there is so much of an influx of pharmaceutical interests and pharmaceutical monies that influence the decisions for getting vaccines approved by the FDA, getting vaccines added to the schedule by the CDC. That, and you have to understand that vaccines are big business. They make lots and lots of money. If a vaccine gets voted to the childhood schedule and it's then added to the childhood schedule, that's a proposition of no less than $1 billion a year sales for that particular vaccine, for that particular constituency. And then you look at the money that was made over the COVID-19 vaccine, $54 billion to Pfizer, 30 plus $billion to Moderna. And so there's a lot of money following this industry. It's not in the olden days where vaccines were not considered big business, but really, since the schedule has exploded, there is a lot of money to be made in this particular area of pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I mean, I totally understand that. The thing that's mind-boggling is like I'm sure if we're, passing out like heroin cigarettes, like literal heroin cigarettes, it'll be like, I'm sure, what do you think? Like at least 25% of people would be like awesome and they'd smoke their heroin cigarettes. And eventually, the heroin would cause them to perish and die ultimately, due to addiction. So, I mean, we know it's clearly bad, so like we could market a lot of bad things and make billions and trillions of dollars out of it. Like, how is it that we know these vaccines are bad yet they're still pushed, and in fact they're even encouraged despite what the science says?
Exactly. And we were told over the pandemic by Dr. Fauci to trust the science. And we were told to vaccinate with a vaccine that did not prevent infection, that did not prevent transmission, and it's debatable whether it prevented hospitalization and death. But yet we were told to trust that. And instead, we should be testing the science and looking at the actual scientific outcome, and myriad vaccine injuries that are associated with COVID-19, including especially, cardiac related vaccine injuries, where, we're seeing increases in all cause mortality in the United States, an area where the vaccine uptake rate was about 79%. And so, you hear these mantras all the time. Vaccines are safe and effective. Take your vaccines. You've got to stay up to date on the schedule. But yet, when you peel that back and you really look at, a vaccine packet insert that shows all the adverse events, or whether it's been tested on pregnant women and things like that, then you can see really the underbelly is not what it seems.
It just seems like catastrophe, but the question becomes how and why have we even been allowed to get to that point of catastrophe where essentially we have this vaccine industry that seems to be, I mean, really destroying children. Then you have the COVID-19 vaccine that is, we know has caused myocarditis, is a negative as opposed to a positive. So essentially,
Right.
we have a lot of these negatives that are fed to us that we somehow pay for, and then it destroys our health. I mean, that just sounds like, you know, really like if odd that that's even been allowed. That's even a topic of like conversation right now.
Well, I think there are so many scare tactics that are following, especially COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 virus, that have really, scared the pants out of people. We had a very, very drastic and draconian response to the virus coming to the United States. And everywhere you go, everywhere pharmaceutical ads on television, pop-ups on the internet, where you are bombarded with this information and with
Mhm.
this message that these will help you. This will help you not get shingles, or this will help you not get respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, older, as you age.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of people really buy into that message. And if you don't if you don't read beyond the title, if you don't read beyond, just the advertisement, then sure, you're going to look at it and say, no, I don't want to get that. Oh, that could cause pneumonia, whatever.
Hmm.
And the mortality rates of COVID-19 in the United States are drastically overblown. We see a lot of instances where people were counted as dying of COVID when they actually died with COVID.
Hmm.
And so, I think that the scare tactics are really at the maximum, and that motivates people, want to do things for their safety, for their family's health. You good person, you're a good parent, you vaccinate. That's just what you do.
Hmm. Is I mean, we need to have a lot of people involved in this conspiracy to make it work. I mean, however way you look at it, because this level of fraud that we're talking about, where people are essentially brainwashed into harming themselves more or less. I mean,
Right.
it takes a whole world, a whole industry, and it takes a lot of players. And in doing this book, I mean, deep does it go? Is it as simple as looking at somebody like Anthony Fauci and saying, like he and Ralph Barrick put this whole, COVID-19 thing together for their own gain? I mean, or does it go beyond that? What could you tell us about that topic?
Well, really, this particular book is more of a compendium of all the Vax Unvax studies. We really wanted to hit that message hard. Let's look at the chronic health outcomes, the infectious disease, the more chronic autoimmune disorders, and drive that message home. There is Mr. Kennedy wrote The Real Anthony Fauci, that goes more into detail on that, on that front. And then he's also writing that will come out in November, the cover up at Wuhan. And so, there are other books that really address the pandemic more head on. In this particular book, we wanted to make it more of a handbook that, if you had a question about a specific vaccine or a specific adverse event, you could look in the index or look at that particular chapter and then become educated, rather quickly on, the pitfalls of the vaccine schedule or the COVID-19 shot or the influenza vaccine or vaccines in pregnancy, things like that.
In general, though, you found that a lot of these vaccines are ultimately causing more damage than good.
Yes. If you look at the risk benefits of these particular vaccines, you're really hard pressed to see the benefit, especially when you look at when it comes down to mortality, of these particular infections versus mortality that's associated with the individual vaccines. It really just does not make sense. There's been probably one reported death due to the measles in the United States in the past 20 years. But if you look at the rate of vaccine injury and vaccine death from the MMR vaccine, it far eclipses that by over 100 times. There have been many, many reported deaths associated with the MMR vaccine. And so when you start to look at that, when you look at the risk benefit ratio, vaccines do come up lacking. And when you look at sort of society wide, what we're also going through with the epidemic of things like myocarditis and pericarditis, ischemic stroke, myocardial infarction, other related issues, neurological issues, Bell's palsy, shingles is also on the rise. And all of these have been attributed to the COVID-19 shot.
It's like the groundwork to the COVID-19 shot is really all the sort of things you're talking about. There's an entire book that you've put together with different vaccines, all which
Right.
have more negative effects on the human body than positive effects. I mean, overwhelmingly, you're saying that these vaccines are really causing more damage than good. There seems to be a culture there. There seems to be a foundation, a mass conspiracy that even makes something like fooling people into taking what many would call a death jab in the COVID-19 vaccine. It seems like a lot of the things you're talking about is the groundwork to that mindset of how they were able to get away with that.
Exactly. But one of the interesting things is that more and more people are really starting to wake up and understand. When you look at the latest booster that has been distributed and it's on the market, only 17% of the US population got it. And
Mm,
so there's a lot of, COVID fatigue going on. And I think that the pharmaceutical industrial complex and the people, in power like Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx have really overplayed their hand. And they've gone to the well just too many times, saying, okay, we'll approve another booster. The first ones didn't work. Even President Biden said, yes, we're going to sink $5 billion into making a vaccine, and this time the vaccine's actually going to work. People are waking up. They're starting to see. And when they start to look at the COVID-19 shot in particular, then they start to look at what are the profits been for the rest of the vaccination schedule. What's going on. So more and more people are starting to wake up, ask more questions. And my hope is that the book inspires many conversations, with parents, with individuals making vaccine decisions for themselves, and also with medical practitioners that have just sort of followed the party line, just all along.
yeah, I mean, is it mind blowing to you? Because I'm just thinking again, and I know I'm kind of repeating this question in a way, but you're
Sure.
looking at this whole, I'm looking at how many people you would need for this immense fraud to be possible, right? If I came to you and I said, okay, I'm going to convince the mass population to do things that are clearly bad for their health, and they're going to think they're doing good things for their health, and they're going to be under this spell for decades where they're thinking they're doing something really good, but nonetheless they're doing something really bad, and at the same time we're going to make billions and billions of dollars out of this immense fraud. I'd say you're crazy, because you would need so many people to buy into that fraud to go along with it, and to go along with it for long periods of time, that I think that either you'd need gazillion dollars to do it, or it's impossible. But it's yet been the realities on the ground are that is what exists.
It's been very successful. And, vaccination has been this thread through society. Although, you look at the explosion of the vaccination schedule, like I said, I got 5 vaccines when I was a child.
Mhm,
You look at the explosion of the vaccination schedule, it was sort of just, things were snuck on there
mhm.
as the advisory committee for immunization practices was voting for more and more vaccines to be added to the schedule. But the thing that's really insidious is that these have not been tested together. That the FDA does not test these vaccines together. When a child goes in for their 2-month well baby checkup, they can get as many as 6 vaccines all at one time. And yet, when they're tested individually. They're
Wow,
not tested in
wow.
concert, but that's very, very far from what reality is when, when you're trying to, a pediatrician trying to get all the vaccines in,
I
26
mean,
needle sticks.
your own children are being experimented on. They're really the
Correct.
test subjects, and we're finding out that it destroys some children. It makes them autistic, neurological disorders. I mean, basically, children are the guinea pigs.
Exactly. It's a grand medical experiment. And when you look at the even the Institute of Medicine, which is it's an independent institution that, however, it is paid for by other government institutions, by the CDC, but
Mhm,
they stepped back and they looked at 158 different vaccine adverse events that had been attributed to vaccines,
mhm,
and they looked at the open literature to see what the open literature said about these adverse events. For 135 of those, the science was insufficient to rule out a relationship between the vaccine and the adverse event. So essentially, when you vaccinate your child, you're undergoing this grand medical experiment where people are just saying, well, we don't really know. We don't know, even with autism, which the CDC says there's no relationship with vaccines and autism. Even with autism, the Institute of Medicine came back and said, well, it's indeterminate whether the DTaP vaccine causes autism. There's just not enough data. So why are we taking these chances? Why are we actually executing a vaccination schedule hasn't been tested adequately. The vaccines have not been tested together, and there are so many question marks around the different adverse events that are happening.
I mean, if you look at these people that made this possible, you're looking at monsters basically, because the carnage we're talking about is, it really makes like some of the worst human beings, like the Stalins and the Hitlers, look like amateurs comparatively.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good observation. And you see really what happened over the pandemic, the redistribution of wealth. The rich became richer. The National Institutes of Health have patents with Moderna. And so therefore, when the likes of, Dr. Anthony Fauci, whose net worth actually doubled, more than doubled over the pandemic, when the likes of those individuals are making that decision, they're also voting their colleagues rich. Everybody that holds a patent with Moderna, with Pfizer, when that patent gets executed, they can make up to $150,000 a year on top of their salary for that particular patent. So, there's a lot of incentivization for, these independent arbiters of vaccines and vaccine safety to, vote themselves rich.
Wow, wow. Let me ask you, how was it working with RFK Jr.? What was it that made the business marriage of this an ideal one for this particular book?
Well, I can tell you the truth. I've worked with Mr. Kennedy since 2015. I was put on the board of Children's Health Defense. Back then, we called it the World Mercury Project in 2017. And so I've worked pretty closely with him throughout the years. But really, he has an uncanny ability to understand science. He is the most scientific non-scientist I think I've ever met. He digests the information. He is a voracious reader. And when you look at his litigation history and the amount of effort that he's put into environmental litigation, he really, he's digested so much science over his lifetime that, again, it was a delight to work with him. He also encourages others to read science. And, I think that's one of the important things of the book is we want people to do the research for themselves, and we want to distill it down so they could do their own research. And that's something that Bobby has been, calling for many, many years.
So let me ask you, is there a follow-up to this book that you're working on, or?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that because as the book was being printed, Mr. Kennedy, he sent me more studies. And so he had found more studies where there was an unvaccinated group of individuals for comparison. And so, yes, we will have a second edition of the book, an updated edition of the book. And one of the things that we found was that for some vaccines, there were real holes in the literature. So we want to, double over our efforts to look for more studies, more papers, things like Vax Unvax studies for the HPV vaccine, Vax Unvax studies around the anthrax vaccine and its connection to Gulf War syndrome. So, yeah, there are some, chapters that we found just sort of a small sample of information, and we're looking on expanding those. So, yes, definitely there will be a second edition of the book.
Let me ask you, I'm looking at vaccines in general, and I'm seeing a more wiser world, a more wiser culture, society. Flat out ban vaccines because we've yet to talk about is there a vaccine that doesn't cause harm?
I wish I could say there was. I wish I could say that there was a vaccine. When you look at the additives, when you look at then adding that on top of either live viruses or killed viruses or attenuated virus particles, I don't think anybody gets a pass. I think every particular vaccine has some level of damage associated with it. And I would dare say that the risk benefit ratio would come out lacking for each one. And the vaccination practices then also augment that. Things like giving the hepatitis B shot to a 1-year-old baby which is part of the CDC schedule, makes absolutely no sense. They're not going to contract hepatitis B. They're not illegal drug users. They're not prostitutes. They're not, and there are other ways. If a newborn is born to a hepatitis B positive mother, there are other ways of protecting that newborn. And so, some of the practices, they make so little sense once you really, really start to look into it. But no, I don't think anybody gets a pass on this.
Wow, it's amazing. I mean, it's amazing that, we think that we're like evolved and, we have technology and all that stuff, but like nobody's figured out that this, I mean, while it was happening, nobody said, hey, maybe it's a bad idea to put all these vaccines into a child without testing how they work together, what the repercussions are. I mean, you buy shampoo and they'll torture 20 animals with shampoo before they release it into the market, but yet injecting children, it seems to be like the shoddiest operation as to what got us to this point that we're now realizing, oh no, it's calamity. By the way, while at the same time having a multi-billion-dollar apparatus trying to cover that truth up.
Right. And you look at the amount of money that chases vaccine publicity and vaccine advocacy. The CDC spends $500 million a year promoting vaccines. $500 million a year. The CDC spends a fraction of that, less than 10% of that on vaccine safety. Okay. But yet they are the arm, they're the post-market surveillance after they're out on the market looking at vaccine safety. That is the apparatus in the federal government that does that. But yet they spend 10 times as much money plus advocating for vaccines rather than checking to see if they're safe.
I mean, that's just bananas. That's bananas. That sounds like to me the third party company that the pharmaceutical companies hire to help build their business, like a marketing company. That's what it sounds like. But it's supposed to be essentially an independent governmental agency that's supposed to hold them in check.
Right. But the CDC is a captured agency, like the FDA. If you look at the FDA, over 45% of their revenues come from big pharma. And if you look at the CDC, a lot of the money passes through what's called the CDC Foundation. So, pharmaceutical industry can support the CDC through the foundation, and they can funnel money into their own pet projects. And when these vaccines are voted upon, these committees, they have so many conflicts of interest within the committee members that, almost 60% of the current advisory committee for immunization practice, almost 60% of them have what are called conflicts of interest waivers. So, they can own stock in a company. They can vote vaccines for that company. They can execute things like insider trading. There's just really no check and balance, and there's no, there is no way that you can wind your way through the system and be unscathed. Everything is touching pharmaceutical money, and you see that over and over again. I was an employee for a federal contractor. When I was an employee for a federal contractor, I was incentivized to patent my work because I knew that I could get $150,000 a year royalty stream. If it got up to that level, that was the cap of the royalty stream, which at the time would have been more than my salary.
I mean, it's insane. I mean, there's clear financial incentive.
Yes.
And it's like we see this over and over again. It seems as though the whole thing has become one where there's financial incentive to do things that are destructive to people, culture, the country, whatever. And I mean, I'm going across multiple different situations, stories, real life stories of what's happening right now. Where people are essentially given financial incentive, like remdesivir in the hospitals. If you somebody dies in a hospital, they everything's like all kinds of destruction of we the people through multiple methods seems to have a financial upside to it. I mean, it's
exactly
absolutely insane. It's insane. It's like And so really what's happening is the world's becoming just utterly corrupted as a result, where like human life means nothing, a child's mental health, a child's future means nothing. I mean, that's just some pretty nasty realities when you think about it.
Exactly. And looking at the chronic disease epidemic, it's big business. It's big business. It supports the pharmaceutical industry if we're all taking prescription drugs for chronic ailments and chronic disorders. And you look at healthcare in general, it's sick care. It
Mhm.
is, medicine that, you continually take, but getting to somebody to the point where they're healthy and stable and off pharmaceutical drugs is no longer the objective.
No, no, not at all, not at all. Not when there's such financial incentive and destruction. Flat.
Yes.
Was there, Brian? Is there anything about the book and your work in terms of uncovering what's been going on? Is there anything we didn't talk about that you'd like to mention?
Well, I really think that the new frontier of the pharmaceutical industry is vaccines in pregnancy, or what they call prenatal vaccines. And I really take pause for that because prior to the 2000s, we did not vaccinate pregnant women. We looked at natural interventions, things that, pregnant women did not receive antibiotics, they didn't receive other types of drugs. But yet now, with the advent of the flu shot in the early 2000s, and then adding the Tdap vaccine after that, and now the COVID shot, and then finally the RSV, the respiratory syncytial virus, on top of that, this is becoming the new frontier, but we really don't know what we're doing. None of these are tested in pregnancy. None of these have been tested synergistically in pregnancy. They haven't been tested for mutagenicity. Do they mutate DNA? Do they cause birth defects? And so it really concerns me what we're looking at. And even the chapter on vaccines in pregnancy in the book, now we've added another one. We've added RSV, which has been approved by the FDA for anywhere between 26 and 34 weeks gestational age. And so that's going to be a new one that's going to be added to the book. But I want to get this book in the hands, so people people making decisions, family planning decisions, can read the book. People making other decisions, regarding whether they're going to get a COVID shot, whether they're going to get a COVID booster, to really be able to read this book. And so, I hope that more and more people will read it. More and more people will start to ask these questions, ask questions directly to the practitioners on these so important decisions.
I mean, do you think like really people are actually still considering getting COVID shots? You think there's still that many people misinformed, ill-informed that they would go do that sort of thing?
Given the scare tactics, yes. I mean, we hear about new variants and, how the variants are changing and they're going to be more infective. And there's a lot of spitballing going on regarding the latest variant of the COVID-19 virus. And so I think a lot of this is by design to scare people into getting their vaccines. There are lots of public service announcements. There's lots of coverage in the mainstream media, but there's ample little coverage regarding the flip side. What
Mhm.
happens when somebody's vaccine injury? It's almost like that's reserved for the alternative media. And so, even though we're in this, we're supposedly through the pandemic, I think that there's more inertia and there's more money to be made.
Wow, wow. Regarding, I'm just curious regarding the future outlook. After you've been, a lot of experience here, you're working with a presidential candidate,
True.
historically significant presidential candidate. I mean, talk about a family who's been attacked by the deep state on so many levels. What do you see as where do you, future prediction? Where do you see this is all going? I mean, it seems as though we're at a critical juncture here. Where's this all going, in your opinion?
Well, again, like I said before, I think that the pharmaceutical industry has really overplayed their hand. And so people are going to make wiser decisions. There, more and more people are starting to wake up with the COVID-19 vaccine and looking at the rest of the vaccine schedule with some level of skepticism. And so that to me is very, very encouraging. I do believe that, in general, people have fatigue over the healthcare system of the United States. And there are more and more forces that are showing it for what it is, just sort of this money pit where we're pouring in more and more money, but our outcomes are not good. And so, my hope is that this leads to massive reform, that we can get rid of conflicts of interest, that we can get rid of the administrative state that is like Dr. Fauci, that has been there for eons and eons, making more and more money, off of the federal government and off of these conflicts of interest. That, this really needs to be scrubbed out, and we need to have independent bodies making these decisions. And so I'm encouraged that I see people waking up. I hope that they vote accordingly. Regarding that, I don't, I work for a 501c3, so I don't endorse, any particular political candidate. But I'm excited about things that I see coming out. I'm excited about people waking up.
Well, awesome. Do you think there's going to be any justice in terms of some of these individuals that, some would argue are responsible for a, I don't know, genocide, a Holocaust of sorts?
Well, one would hope so. It's weird because these same people that were making these predictions and gave us these draconian lockdowns and masking and, and vaccinate are now calling for amnesty and and saying, "Oh wow, I got that wrong." Well, you look at the dirty underbelly of this and you can see that no, they knew from the beginning. They
Yeah.
knew from the beginning. They knew the lack of effectiveness of the vaccine. Rochelle Walensky of the CDC flat out lied about that. And so, I think that justice needs to be served. And I hope that it comes. I hope that it comes quickly. And I'm not as good of a prognosticator, but the more and more information that's drifting out through the Freedom of Information Act, the more that we're seeing that the powers that be, they knew exactly what they were doing. It was a big lie from the very, very beginning. And so the more that this gets disseminated, the more, that podcasts like yourself continue on, the better off we are.
Yep. And we're definitely going to do our best to tell people what's going on. And apologies about my camera. It seems to be having some issues. Sometimes happens when we're doing these podcasts and it overheats. But Brian, thank you so much for coming onto the Blood Money podcast. Is there anything else we didn't touch upon that you want to mention in closing, or?
Well, I do hope people read the book. You can get it obviously at Amazon.com or our booksellers. You can get it locally as well. And and again, I was so blessed, such an honor to work with Mr. Kennedy on this particular project, and look for more good things to come.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian, for showing up to the Blood Money podcast. To the viewers out there, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Make sure you join us at americahappens.com, where we have all of our episodes, and make sure you consider donating to americahappens.com so we could keep bringing you information like this that you would not hear in the mainstream news media. Also, make sure you check out our AHN News Live every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. Live news with independent journalists around the country. Blood Money with yours truly, Conspiracy Truths with Mindy Robinson, Gianna Michelli State National University, and Devotions with LW. LW's morning prayer show, 4 a.m. Pacific, 7 a.m. Eastern every morning. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Blood Money. I will see you on the next episode. Take care.